All right. Again, welcome everyone. I'm Alex Lewis. I'm the Director of Business Operations with Prospect HR Consulting. Um, my role sits at the intersection of sort of operations and people. So this is a topic that I very much love. I'm really excited to be moderating today's conversation. Joining me, we have three amazing panelists. We have Susan Krieger, who is the founder and CEO of Prospect HR. Um, Prospect HR is an HR consulting firm that partners with nonprofits and mission-driven organizations to build HR infrastructure and keep their people and their mission protected. So from compliance and hiring to training and org development, Prospect HR provides a strategic hands-on HR support that lets nonprofits stop reacting and start leading. Um, Joining Susan is Andrea Bishop, who is the Director of Quality Assurance with Validity Screening Solutions. Validity Solutions is a PBSA accredited technology enterprise specializing in employment screening and drug testing solutions. Validity offers streamlined, customizable, and cost-effective approach to employment screening by using the latest integration technology and compliance standards. And lastly, we have Amy Benz, who is the Director of Operations from Safe Gathering. Safe Gathering is a division of Validity Screening Solutions that specializes in background screening and abuse prevention training for organizations that serve youth, children, and vulnerable adults. Their system combines integrated background checks and online training into a single streamlined process, making it easier for churches, nonprofits, and community organizations to screen and train volunteers and staff with confidence. Thank you all for being here. And with that, let's dive in. We're going to start the session with sort of a mindset for the rest of the conversation. We're going to start at the beginning of a process, which is really recruiting volunteers. So Susan, I want to start with you from an HR perspective. When a nonprofit decides that they need to recruit volunteers specifically, what should that process look like? And how does that mimic or differ from an employment recruitment process? Oh, sorry.
Okay, I think we're good. It would help if I'm unmuted as you ask me my question. So thank you so much, Alex, for the introduction and for everybody gathering here today, taking time out of your day. Hopefully, you'll have a lot to take away from the session today. So thank you all for joining. Over the years, as Alex described, Prospect HR Consulting, we work with many not-for-profits as well as for-profits with mission-driven ideas. But with our for-profits, we've worked with a number of clients that bring in volunteers in various ways. So they might rely on volunteers extensively throughout the year. They might need them seasonally, or they might need them sort of for a one-off event. I'd say most of the clients we work with are more in the category of seasonal or year round. So, we've seen a real wide variety of the way volunteers are used in organizations, and along with that, we've seen a very wide variety of the way people bring in volunteers and have a process or not around volunteers, ranging from really scrappy, informal ways of doing it to a much more formal process. And we've worked with our clients to put in place a process around that. So just to your question around recruiting,
Yes.
the recruiting process with volunteers, I'd start with a best practice to approach volunteer hiring and onboarding is very much like your employee process, but with important differences. And we'll get into those a little bit more in detail, but there are a few things to keep in mind initially about differences from your employee recruiting practices and your volunteer. First, I'll say there are basically three things to keep in mind. Uh, First of all, with a volunteer, there is never a promise of compensation, which probably most of you know, and that's very important. And where it gets a little trickier is that your volunteers should not be doing the same work as your paid staff. So that's an important difference. And typically, only established nonprofits can use volunteers. So I think the recruiting process is a great way to start our conversation today, but I'd like to zoom out a little bit and look at the recruiting process within a broader framework. Just like it is for your recruiting process with employees, it's an activity within a process. So within that process, you have a before, you have a during, and you have an after, and we'll cover those pieces today. So let's look at the phases initially, just sort of at a high level. We can talk a little bit about that in more detail as we get into the conversation. But initially, you want to plan, just like with your employee recruiting process. You want to have a planning process. You want to assess what your needs are. You also want to have a job description. So your job descriptions, while not necessarily as detailed, you want to make sure you know what your needs are and that you're bringing in volunteers for those specific needs. So it's important for you internally, but it's also very important for the volunteer that you're bringing in so they know what the expectations are. Also, have a process within your organization that's designated for your volunteers. So maybe a particular person. Again, it doesn't have to be super formal, but you have somebody who people know they can go to, and that you've established some policies and procedures that impact volunteers specifically. There's a bit of an overlap with some employee policies, but mostly uh, it's a separate process. You don't use your employee handbook for your volunteers. Then you need to look at your outreach process. You want to, similar to recruiting, you want to identify target audience. Um, you want to look for people who are most interested in your mission. Where are you going to find those people? Very similar, you're going to post for them. There are specific volunteer places to post, volunteer match, idealist. You can use social media and also local community job boards, libraries. You could reach out to your donor list, things like that. You also want an application and a screening. And I'm going through these things quickly, and maybe we can provide some information to people after the session. But you do want an application process. It can, again, simplified, asking very basic questions, keep people engaged and motivated to participate with you. You also want some kind of an interview process and then background checks, which we'll discuss in more detail later. Then you want to also have a selection process where you match your volunteers with what the needs are. And I will advise you make sure to get back to people. Even if you decide this person is not a good fit for you, let them know. Because sometimes volunteers assume if they raise their hand, you want them there and they show up, even if you don't. So that could happen. So I'll just leave it at that as the different steps.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Susan. I think that's actually a really good point there at the end to make sure you're getting back to everyone. Not even to make sure that you have the right volunteers show up on the first day of an orientation process for volunteers, but also, not getting back to someone could potentially negatively impact, what your nonprofit's like culture might be perceived as. And that can negatively impact any future recruiting efforts or process. Um, I actually have a question for the audience that I'm just sort of throwing in here because I realized it would be a great thing for our panelists to know. what type of volunteer recruiting are you doing right now? Do you have like one-time event volunteers? Do you have a seasonal volunteer process? Do you have individuals in long-term volunteer positions? We'd love to hear from you in the chat while we keep having conversation. Um, Susan, I'm going to stick with you for a second because I think we should dig a little bit deeper and just confirm this for everyone. Um, does your recruitment process or approach differ depending on the volunteer type that you're looking for? So, like that one-time event volunteer versus a long-term ushering role, or for example, or is it the same consistent process regardless?
Yeah, I would say from our experience in working with our clients that have different needs, there is a difference. And a one-time event certainly could be an abbreviated process, and it could be a general call for volunteers, and you talk to people in a group. But there still might be some requirements depending on uh, what your organization does and the services they provide. There still might be requirements for
Mhm.
some sort of background screening or certification. So sort of keep that in mind. But there absolutely can be differences. And I'll say it's important to make the process very engaging and simple for the people who are volunteering because they're volunteering their time. So you want to try to tailor it to what you're doing. I think that's important.
Okay. I think that's great. And, looking at the chat here, it looks like we have a mix of folks who have seasonal volunteers, one-time volunteers, ongoing volunteers. So that's just helpful for our panelists to know who exactly they're speaking to here. Um, Amy, let's bring you into the conversation. Do you have anything else to add in terms of volunteer recruitment while we stick with that subject matter for the moment?
Sure. Um, yeah, I think that volunteer recruitment it does foundationally mimic the employment recruitment process. But as Susan mentioned, the the job posting per se will be more, as far as a volunteer, will be more focused on the why, the
Hmm.
mission of the group, the impact of the group, while the employee job posting would be focusing on compensation, skills, requirements, things like that.
Hmm.
And as far as the application goes, I do agree that for a volunteer, it should be a simplified process. For an employee application, you're going to maybe require employment history, verifications of credentials, things of that nature. And the interview process, for the employee, it will be more a qualification of skills, but for a volunteer, it might be more of a two-way conversation. What are your interests? Where could we best put you?
Hmm.
And then as far as um, one-time or short-time volunteers versus long-time volunteers, um, when working with vulnerable populations, I definitely think background checks are a must, whether they're going to be there one day or several days, several weeks, because that one day, could their actions on that one day could have very lasting effects on your organization. And another thing is, I think that you want to build kind of a transition with those one-time volunteers in that, okay, we've done the background check on you now. So if you'd like to come back and volunteer in
Hmm.
the next month or two or 3 months, we've already vetted you and
Yeah.
you're good to go. So it just makes the process a little bit easier if they do decide to come back. And we all know that, volunteers are critical to a nonprofit organization.
I appreciate that additional insight and really like the clarification. I mean, that's absolutely correct. Like the recruitment process for a volunteer does have some mimics and overlaps, but there are some, as Susan mentioned as well, like very clear distinctions. Um, and in the spirit of sort of the background checks for volunteers as well, I'm going to ask the audience another question. True or false? If a volunteer causes harm to another volunteer, a visitor, or an employee, you're not responsible. Your liability only extends to your paid employees. Go ahead and answer that in the chat. I'm curious if everyone is on the same page here. And Amy, do you want to go ahead and answer that question? Although it looks like our audience is clear on that point, which we're very happy about.
Yes, if you answered false, you are correct.
Um, Amy, do you have anything to sort of like expand that or any like explanation that you can share with everyone as well? And then we'll ask Susan to chime in.
Yes, I mean, vol or nonprofit organizations are still bound by the FCRA, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and volunteers as well as employees fall under that. So the actions of a volunteer or the nonprofit organization could be liable for the actions of a volunteer, for sure. I lost my train of thought.
That is
I
okay.
could jump in a little bit. But go ahead. I don't want to step on your toes there.
No, so an organization could be liable for ordinary negligence by a volunteer. Absolutely. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. And there are other ways that a not-for-profit can be liable. And I think we're going to cover some of that in a little while, but there are federal and state and local laws that cover discriminatory practices, harassment, and it's important to know where you're located, what does apply to you. And it's not only what your volunteer might do with their behavior, but also how people who might be visitors or guests or people who participate, how they act towards your volunteers as well. So it's important to understand, where those lines are and how to deal with things when they do come up.
absolutely. Yeah. And just because a volunteer is there for one day, there's still a reflection of your organization.
Absolutely. That reputational issue is really important for your organization and also for your being able to recruit volunteers.
Yeah. And Amy, if you could just answer this for the audience real quick, just for those who might not be aware, what is the FCRA?
Yeah, the FCRA, that stands for Fair Credit Reporting Act. And that's in short, that's a federal law that really governs how information can be collected about you and how it can be used when it comes to pre-employment screening or credit reports, things like that. So the applicant, has certain rights under the FCRA, and the employer must follow certain guidelines when it comes to the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Now, the FCRA, as I mentioned, does include volunteers. It's not only for paid staff, it does include volunteers.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that additional clarification. Andrea, you've been so patient waiting for us to bring you into the conversation. So let's shift to you a little bit. Say a nonprofit has like made a decision that they want to onboard a new volunteer. Okay. What is like initiating that background process or that background check look like for them? Can you walk us through just some basic steps and what you should have in hand before initiating?
Absolutely. So Susan went through the planning, recruiting, interviewing, and selecting a volunteer. So after you select the person that you want to bring in as a volunteer, it's time to do a background check. So the first and most important thing, if you don't have this, you can't really run a background check, is going to be that authorization for the background check. And Along with that authorization, you also have to have a standalone disclosure. That disclosure is letting the candidate know that a report may be obtained, and it's going to describe the different items that you'll be seeking out in that report. So, for example, if you're going to be running a credit check on somebody, that disclosure would be the document that says we're going to obtain a credit report on you. So that has to be separate from the authorization. You have to present that disclosure to the candidate along with the authorization and a summary of their rights under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. That's a one-page document that can and should be downloaded and provided to every volunteer. I just wanted to mention this is the same requirement that you would have for bringing on a new employee as well. So this is mirrored. It's a requirement for volunteers as well. So if you're not doing this for employees already, you should be, but also definitely doing it for volunteers. The volunteer has to sign that authorization. It's not just on you to create that document. They actually have to sign it and put a date on it. It is important to keep those dates fresh. So if you have a volunteer that's coming back year after year, try to get a new authorization signed from them every year if possible. If not, do your best. There's always a chance you won't get audited on that, but if something goes wrong and you don't have an updated authorization and you're still performing screenings, you could run into trouble later. And go ahead and retain that fresh copy for at least 5 years and retain the old copies for 5 years. So if you bring them on in 2024, you have a signed authorization from that year, keep it until 2029, but also keep 2025, keep that one until 2030. Just make sure you always have a fresh copy. Aside from the paperwork, you also need to have the candidate's personal identifying information to actually perform the screening. So think their social security number, date of birth, alias names. If you partner with a background screening provider, we're going to help you out with 99% of this process. But if you don't have us, these are just things to keep in mind to keep yourself on track.
Thank you so much for that very comprehensive step-by-step process. I see several questions coming in the chat at the moment related to that, which we will get back to. I do want to keep the conversation moving forward at the moment. And just to kind of, again, clarify for everyone, is there any difference in background screening process for someone who's coming in for a single day event versus someone who's going to be there long-term or even seasonally?
So ultimately, it's going to be up to the organization to define a policy and a process that serves their organization the best, minimizes risk, protects the populations that you're serving. I do think that it can depend on the role, and the depth of the background check can also differ depending on the role. Just for example, a person placed in a nursery or another child care role or child supervision role, even if it's only for one day, that background screening is going to look different or should look different than somebody that's placed in a more administrative type of role. For example, the child care role or volunteer should be subjected to the child abuse and neglect screenings before they're allowed to volunteer in that capacity. It's just super important, like Susan was mentioning in the beginning, to document what are the responsibilities that this role is going to have. What do we need out of this volunteer? And make sure that those are well documented and you've interviewed and screened for the right people. And you're performing a background check that covers those needs. So, yeah.
I'll add something there. With some of our clients where we've worked with preschools, and while the individuals who actually work directly with the children certainly get background screening, we also do it with administrators because they do interact, even if it's accidentally or it's not specifically in their job description, there is some interaction. So think about that as well. Think about it broadly.
On a personal note, even as a parent volunteer going into my kids' school, I got screened for this to be able to go talk to their class and be present and be there. So I think this is incredibly important, and thank you for those clarifications. Um, Amy, you are our vulnerable populations expert on this call. Are there any additional considerations for seniors, people in crisis, et cetera? Are there any findings that are like automatic disqualifiers or anything that you can add to that?
Yes, absolutely. I do want to go back though and mention, as far as screening your one-time volunteers, your long-term volunteers, you also need to check with your insurance liability policy because they may require that same screening for a 1 day or a long-term volunteer. Um, and yes, when it comes to working with the vulnerable population, there are stricter requirements, as I guess there should be. Um, so things that on our end for safe gatherings or for someone working with the vulnerable population, automatic qualifiers would be presence on the sex offender registry,
Hmm.
any kind of violent crimes, assault. Let's see, that's really and one myth is that just because someone is on the sex offender registry does not mean that there's an actual criminal court case that you're going to find.
Mm.
So someone could be on the sex offender registry, but had that criminal court case either dismissed or it was a suspended imposition of sentence or a diversion to where the court said, if you complete these steps, that conviction will be taken off your record. However, you will still be required to be reported as a sex offender.
Okay.
So that is one important note is just by doing a criminal record search doesn't mean you're going to find the sex offenses and vice versa. So you do want to do a comprehensive screening for sure.
And I guess I'll ask this question very directly as well. What if we have a volunteer that's going to be like driving a tram or a bus or something with like vulnerable population as the occupants? Anything specific from a driving perspective that would be an automatic disqualifier?
Yes, and you will also want to check with your insurance carrier, of course, but obviously someone that has a suspended driver's license would not be allowed to drive. And then different groups have different policies, so it depends on your organizational policy.
Mhm.
So having one DUI within a certain number of years might disqualify you, or having so many tickets within a particular time frame might disqualify you. But that all comes back to having or the importance of having a clear policy with your organization.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the additional clarification. Andrea, do you have anything else to add to what Amy has shared so far?
I do. So we're talking about disqualifiers, things that you have identified you cannot work with. You're not going to bring a volunteer in if they have these kinds of offenses, and you have that documented in your policy. So, under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, there are some additional steps that have to be followed whenever you are going to deny somebody, even if it is a volunteer opportunity. It's not even an employment volunteer or an employment opportunity. It is a volunteer. You still have to follow the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And we've already talked about the beginning stages with the authorization, the disclosure, the summary of rights. In that summary of rights, it actually tells your volunteer that they will be allowed to go through the pre-adverse and adverse action phases. So if you don't follow through with what I'm about to describe, your candidate, your volunteer, they will know that you're not doing what you're supposed to do. And that can open you up to risk, even though you're not bringing this person in to volunteer with you. So pre-adverse is a notice that goes out to the candidate, the volunteer, basically the second that you've decided they're disqualified. You know you're not going to bring them in. Something in the background check has caused you to say they're disqualified. They're not eligible to come work with us or come volunteer with us. The pre-adverse action is letting the candidate know something came up in your background check and we're not going to move forward. It gives the volunteer an opportunity to contact whoever did the background check, which is in the pre-adverse notice. You have to say, where did this information come from? Well, it came from the background check, and Validity Screening Solutions gave it to me. And then our contact information is there in that notice. So the pre-adverse is letting them know you're not moving forward. This is why, and this is who gave us the information. The volunteer then has a chance to contact whoever provided you with that information and say, hey, that's not accurate. That it's a different John Smith that did that. It wasn't me. It gives a chance for a reinvestigation to be performed if needed. Gives a chance for a dispute, correct any inaccuracies. So you send the pre-adverse. A volunteer has a chance to dispute, say their piece, get anything corrected that may need to be corrected. I'm just going to go down the path of, let's say there's nothing that needs to be corrected. Nothing is changing on the report. You have to wait a reasonable amount of time before sending that final adverse action notice. Reasonable amount of time is extremely vague, and I apologize for that. That is how it's written in the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and it drives us insane as well. Most compliance experts recommend waiting at least 5 business days, calling that a reasonable amount of time. I will tell you, it's important to write down what you are going to do and follow through with that every time. Make sure that the person who is in charge of this process follows the same process every time. If you identify 3 days, whoever you have in charge of this process needs to wait 3 days every single time. You can't wait 2 days for the next person, 5 days for the following person, 3 days. You have to follow what you have identified and follow it every single time at whatever's in your policy. After you have waited your reasonable waiting period, you can send the final adverse action notice to the candidate. And that is the official final notice that you're not moving forward with the volunteer and you're closing the book at that point. Susan had mentioned earlier that there may be situations where you've asked for volunteers and you don't necessarily need all of them. That is a different situation than what we're talking about here. This is someone is disqualified. So that's when you would need to follow the pre-adverse and adverse action process. If it's a situation where somebody's not being disqualified, you just don't necessarily need them this month, then you do not need to follow this process. You would follow what Susan mentioned earlier, just have a conversation with that person and let them know, hey, we don't actually need you, but we have these other opportunities coming up later. So
that is very informative, and thank you so much, Andrea, for all of that information. For those who might be wondering, I'll go ahead and summarize, and we'll provide some sample forms and things like that in our wrap up post recording email communication. So don't worry about that. Susan, I'm going to shift back to you, and I do just want to sort of keep time in mind here. So in few words, can you walk us through a very broad like onboarding experience for a volunteer, right? So we've made the decision, we're hiring this person, they passed their background check. What does it mean to sort of like get them in the door?
Okay, I will say very simply, do an onboarding and training with your volunteers. So if you have, say, seasonal volunteers, set a time to have an onboarding, welcome people, get them all together in one place. Sometimes you need to set 2 different dates or times because you need to get everybody covered, but definitely have a plan, what you should cover. We've talked about a little bit, making it clear what your mission is, your history, talk about your organization, make people excited about what they're doing and why it's important and how much value that they are adding to your organization as well. You want people to be introduced to each other, know each other. You can do some icebreakers and so people can get to know each other. Also, having them get to know staff, that will be important to what they're doing. There also might be some very specific role role-specific training. So you can have a general session, and then you might break out depending on how many volunteers you have and different needs. What can be useful for that is to have a volunteer who has been there before, mentor, or have a new volunteer shadow somebody, or they could do that with a staff member who knows what the volunteer should be doing. Remember, they shouldn't be doing the same thing as the staff member. Then there might be paperwork, and then some training specifically about policies, procedures. There might be safety training that they need to know. And there's also other kinds of training that we could talk about that's more around some of the things we talked about in terms of legal liability, around anti-harassment, discrimination training. But I can leave it at that. But it's important to think about what training is required and keeping your volunteers engaged and excited.
I do want to just, dig a little bit into that training specifically, right? Because I think one of the things that we do, especially if anyone is in New York, where we are based in New York, so I'm going to use New York as an example, anti-harassment training is required annually. And that is true across other states as well. Should volunteers receive anti-harassment training? Is that a requirement as well? Is it a best practice? If you can answer that specifically, Susan, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, there is some gray, not a lot in New York, definitely not a lot in New York City. So it depends on where you're located, and you should know what the requirements are. But as either a best practice or required under the law, yes, you should do anti-harassment training because, as we talked about earlier, your volunteers are protected under, it might not be federal law, but there's state law. The federal law typically, at least the ones we're familiar with, like around Title VII, anti-discrimination law, that's typically covers employees, but volunteers look a lot like employees in a lot of cases. So it's a best practice. It's also important because, as we said, your volunteers are your brand ambassadors. You want them to behave in a way that's appropriate and understand where the lines are in terms of not only with the public, if they interact with the public, but also with other employees.
Thank you for clarifying that. And I think Andrea mentioned it previously, but Amy, to confirm, like abuse prevention training would also be something that should be done as part of a onboarding process, depending on the organization that you're joining, correct?
Absolutely, yes. That is really a non-negotiable when working with the vulnerable population. That will tell them the things to look out for, how to report certain things. And I do know, I do want to point out, as far as the harassment training goes, it depends on the state, as Susan said. And I know in the state of California, you have to provide that training if you have 3 or more employees, and your volunteers and interns count in that number. So you may not necessarily be required to provide that training to a volunteer, but it's definitely best practice, and you always want to look at that those state requirements, because if there ever is a legal issue or claim that's filed and you say, hey, we train our volunteers, we've done everything we can on our end, that's going to look better for you than, well, they're just an employee or they're just a volunteer. We didn't spend time to do the training on that.
And if an organization has offices in multiple states, right? I think also having some consistency. So whatever state has the, I guess, like most restrictive policy would probably be the one that should be followed. So there's also consistency across the organization from a best practice perspective. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned consistency. Because going back to what Andrea was talking about with the Fair Credit Reporting Act and doing background checks, you want to make sure that the background check is consistent based on the role. So
Mhm.
you don't want to say, well, we've known Mary for 15 years. She's just going to be a volunteer. We don't really need to background screen her, but the next volunteer that comes in, we don't really know them, so we're going to background screen them.
Mm.
Well, that's a violation of the FCRA. So
Okay.
based on position, you must do the same type of screening on everyone.
Thank you for clarifying that. It's incredibly important. Andrea, I want to go back to you real quick, because I realize we have not touched on this just yet, but when you have volunteers coming back year after year, should they, just to clarify, should they be rescreened? Like what is what is generally like recommended there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you think about it like this, and I'm not just saying this because we do background checks. Okay, obviously I love background checks. But a background check is a snapshot in time. So at the time of that initial background check, everything was clear, everything was great a year ago. But that could have changed the day after you screened them. That
Hmm.
could have changed a month after you screened them. Not everything hits the news. Sometimes the court process takes a really long time. So you're not going to get a news story until there's a conviction out there or something, just really huge has happened. With a background check, I can tell you that following month if there's a pending case going on that, you need to be concerned about. Your trusted screening provider can give you that information that you need to have that you're not going to know otherwise.
Hmm.
It doesn't mean that somebody's going to have something pop up, but what if they do and then you don't know about it just because you're not rescreening them?
Yeah.
So, I mean, at a bare minimum, we see most of the organizations that we work with screening their volunteers every year. Some of the school districts that we work with are screening at the beginning of each semester. So we'll see a bunch of screenings come through in July for those volunteers that are going to be starting in August. And then we
Hmm.
see a bunch in December for the volunteers that are going to be starting in January. So the school districts are doing it by semester. So really every 4 months, but only
Hmm.
during the school year. It really is up to the organization, your budget, your time, the reasons why you have volunteers as well is really important. If you're working with vulnerable populations, the more frequent you can rescreen, the better.
Yeah.
Some of our organizations that we work with do quarterly rechecks just every 4 months, like clockwork. A
Okay.
lot of the organizations that we work with are sticking to that just annual basis for a rescreen.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. I am going to skip ahead to my panel who knows our general order of things here, because I do want to make sure we have time for the chat and make sure we get some of those very specific questions answered. Um, Before we jump to the chat, Susan, let's start with you. I do want to know, like, what is the I guess like biggest mistake that you've seen a nonprofit make when it comes to volunteer screening and onboarding? Like what triggers like a wake-up call? Like what is the most, I guess, extreme circumstance or situation that you've seen?
I probably haven't seen the most extreme out there, but I think all of what we're talking about
Yeah.
is it's important to to mitigate the possibility of risk out there and
Mhm.
to best ensure a good experience for your volunteers. I will say we have had situations where there's been very inappropriate behavior between
Mhm.
volunteers and staff that we've had to do very extensive investigations that have gotten quite costly and complicated and trying to sort out where the legal issues fall and where the liability has brought in outside counsel. And so you can end up with a very messy, tricky
Mhm.
situation
Yeah.
under circumstances like that.
And I think actually I'm going to broaden this a little bit. Amy, if there's like one takeaway that you could say for everyone today, or like something that is super critical to keep in mind for their screening process, onboarding process, recruitment process, what would you want everyone to sort of like remember walking away today?
I think I would say, as far as compliance goes, you know, some organizations see compliance as just a box to check.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think the thoughts could be shifted to maybe view compliance as just a way to build trust in your organization, uh,
Yep.
secure funding for your mission, or just
Mm-hmm.
um, and again, as far as compliance goes, volunteers are considered the same as employees under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. You must be consistent in the background checks you do per role.
Yep.
And as Andrea mentioned, you need to follow certain steps as well, or you could
Yep.
open yourself up to potential lawsuits.
Okay. Thank you, Amy. Andrea, anything else to add quickly before we jump into the audience questions?
Honestly, I think Amy just covered it super well. I don't have anything else to add right now.
Amazing. Amazing. Um, uh, Shelby, are you ready to kind of go through some questions from the audience?
Yes, I think the first one that we could address would be the name of the authorization form that Andrea was speaking about in the beginning.
Yeah, can you just clarify, Andrea, what the forms are?
Yeah, so there isn't a specific form out there that you need to go download or anything. I mean, it's an authorization form. So it is a document that the candidate signs and dates, giving you permission to obtain the information that you have described in the disclosure. So the disclosure highlights the kind of background check you're going to do, what kind of information about the candidate might be obtained. And then the authorization is a signature page where you are collecting their signature and date to give you permission to run that background check. We do offer a sample. If anybody is interested in that, we could definitely send that around in the follow-up documents.
Yeah.
And it has our watermark on it, but feel free to look at the verbiage and see what we've done with that. So somebody just sent a follow-up question. The auth form is something we can make up. Yes. For lack of a better way to word that, yes, you can make up your own. Obviously, you would want to have somebody look at what is on the like Fair Credit Reporting Act description and just make sure you've met the requirements there. Our sample is a great one that you can use and mirror the verbiage on if you wish. Yeah.
And regarding the pre-adverse, if you decide to choose another candidate because they were more qualified than the one you initially were looking at, is that something that is still needed?
So I actually saw that question come up when I was talking, and I was super excited to see it. So whenever you have selected someone, this verbiage is very important here. You have interviewed and you have selected someone to volunteer for you, and you're just waiting on the background check. In the employment screening world, we call that a conditional offer of employment. You're saying, hey, I'm selecting you, but you have to pass your background check, and then we'll move forward. It's the same for a volunteer. If you have selected them and you have said, as long as your background check is good, we're going to move forward with you, then you're going to be following that pre-adverse process if something in that background check disqualifies them. If you're not selecting that person, even though you've interviewed them, you've collected their application, and you're not selecting them because somebody else in your interview pool was more qualified, then you're not going to move forward with a background check for that person and you don't have to do any pre-adverse action. It can just be a quick note to them, hey, we're moving forward with somebody else, or we don't need you to volunteer at this time. So if you're not pushing a background check through, you're not actually selecting them, then you can forget about that pre-adverse and adverse action process. It'll only be if you've pushed someone through to that stage because you are selecting them, but then the background check unveils something that is a disqualifier for your organization.
And then following up on that, he said, if someone's background is clear, but I don't trust them based on my gut, what would you advise?
Yeah, that's a great question. Hopefully that person would not make it through the interview process.
Yeah.
If you have that gut feeling, then I mean, my suggestion would be just thank them for the interview and don't call them again, probably. I wouldn't push that person through for a background check. If you've got that gut feeling, that's what the interview is for.
Mhm.
Absolutely, is to get that personal experience with that person and decide, is this going to be a good culture fit? Do I feel good about this person? So I would say they did not pass the interview.
Yep. I think that would be from an HR perspective as well. That would be the recommendation. If your gut is off, um, following conversation with that person, you do not have to accept that person as a volunteer, even if they pass, they don't have to make it to that next step and go through the background process.
And then I think we have time for one last question. This one says, if our agency is enrolled in the federal RAP back program, is that sufficient for subsequent criminal activity?
Amy, would you like to handle this one?
You're on mute, Amy.
Sorry.
There you go.
What was the question?
It says, if our agency is enrolled in the federal RAP back program, is that sufficient for subsequent criminal activity?
I am not familiar with that, honestly.
And they said that they are also enrolled in, I believe it's Calvex program.
Um,
So
This question is from Roberta.
I can talk about the federal wrap back really quick. I'm not familiar with Calvex. So here at Validity, we do not recommend FBI background checks for a couple of reasons. At the federal level, not everything gets reported to the FBI by the county courts. When we do a background screening, we don't go to the FBI. We go to the county courts where the individual has lived, or just counties that are associated with that individual, and we go directly to the source. So the FBI is relying on all however many counties there are in the United States, a million counties, to send information into them. There is a lag with that. There is a delay in that information being updated. It may never be updated. There is very little to no oversight over that process. You really are relying on somebody to forward information versus just going directly to the source. It not saying it's a bad program to have as a backup, as just something that's part of your process, but it should not be the only thing that you are relying on for a rescreen. If just because nothing is showing up in those the federal wrap back notifications, you're not getting any new hits right now, it doesn't mean that there actually isn't anything, if that makes sense. So
Thank you. There are a couple questions that we did not get to in the chat, and we'll make sure that we also provide some follow-up answers in our uh, follow-up communication. So thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully you have some takeaways. And hopefully, when it comes to formalizing your process, I mean, it just starts with one intentional improvement, right? Take one step forward. We talked about a lot of things today, but hopefully, you have some stepping stones to start your journey here. Susan, Amy, and Andrea, they provided the framework today. What you do with it is what matters. So I think with that, I'm going to say thank you so much to Susan, Amy, and Andrea. You provided so much information in this conversation today. We'll make sure to summarize some things in our follow-ups here. And thank you to Shelby for monitoring the chat as well. Thank you, audience, for your active participation. Again, the session's recorded, so you'll get some follow-ups within the next 48 hours from us. And with that, we'll release you for the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone. Have a good
you.
afternoon.
Thank
Thank
you.
you
Bye.
all.
Bye-bye.